Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. This is Kathy, and today I'll be creating a shaker card using the candy jar stamp set and the Stitched Squares Slimline, no, the Slimline Stitched Square dies from Trinity Stamps. And this card, while creating it, truly was a comedy of errors. Everything that could potentially go wrong pretty much did go wrong, but I was not going to give up. So this candy jar here is actually the second time that I colored it, and I'll explain the first error that I had made in just a bit. But to color in the jar, I used two cool gray markers, and then I wanted to have the jar have a pink tint to it because I had done a green tint on my Halloween jar, which if you've not seen that video, I'll make sure to link that at the end of this video. Anyway, back to this coloring. I started out with C3 and I used a pretty light hand on that and just added in some darker areas around the edges, and then underneath the little, where there would be like a lip on the jar, like on the lid of the jar. Then I went in with C1 and blended out the C3 a little bit. Next, I brought in RV21 to add the pink tint to my jar. With the pink marker, I did color directly over both the C3 and the C1 marker. And then when I got down to the area where the jar is at its widest point, I didn't worry about coloring that in too much because I knew that I would be die cutting it. The die cut set is really cool because you have a die for the entire candy jar, and then there's another little piece that cuts out the center of the candy jar, which makes it really easy to create a shaker card with this set. After I had added in all of the pink tint that I wanted, I went back over that with the C1 to blend the colors together, but also to dull the pink because I wanted it to still appear to be translucent. After I was done with all of the coloring, I used the full jar die to cut a piece of acetate for my shaker window. I only cut a piece that was big enough for the widest part of the jar where the candy would actually go. And when I'm running acetate through my die cut machine, I like to put a piece of scratch paper underneath it. It seems to help keep the acetate from sticking to the cutting plates. After I had that die cut, I set it aside, and then I grabbed a piece of fun foam and I cut out the full candy jar and also the centerpiece. I just lined them up as best I could, which it's actually really easy to do to get them lined up and have even space on either side. So the fun foam that I have is self-adhesive, and you see how I am adhering the one that I just die cut onto another jar that was colored and die cut and on fun foam. And the reason that I put that fun foam on top of the colored jar is because that was the one that I colored first, and I put it on the fun foam before I put the acetate on there for my shaker window, which overall that turned out to be okay because I ended up with a nice double layer of fun foam with a little bit of added stability with the cardstock underneath the top piece of fun foam. To get rid of some of the excess adhesive that's on the inside rim of the die cut, I used my anti-static powder tool and just tapped it around the edge until it no longer felt sticky. The next thing that I did was I used Tombow Multi-Mono liquid glue to adhere the acetate to the colored jar that is going to go on top of the fun foam. And here, really, you guys, again, I should not be allowed to use liquid glue because I got it everywhere. It squished off and ended up getting on the acetate, and then I wiped that off, but when I flipped it over, that piece landed right in all of the liquid glue that squished off onto my craft mat. So I used my absorber to clean off most of the glue and then dried it with a paper towel, and it appeared that it was still kind of sticky, but it was looking better and it wasn't too smudgy. So once I was done with that, I set that aside, and I had previously colored all of the shaker bits, which is going to be a bunch of different pieces of candy from the stamp set. And to make a long story short, in a previous video of mine, I show where I color all of the candy, and I did leave all of the coloring in of the candy in that previous video. It turns out that I changed my mind, halfway through making the card, and ended up with a bunch of leftover pieces and decided that I could use them for a shaker card. But I did want to include some of the coloring in this video just to share how I actually colored the pieces of candy. I had stamped the images using My Favorite Things Extreme Black Hybrid ink onto Cougar Super Smooth cardstock. And for the coloring, I did very simple coloring. It was a 2-color blend, and I filled in the image with my lightest color. Then I added some shading with a darker color, and then I went back over it again with my lightest color. With the exception of the candy with the double heart, I only colored in the little heart in the center with my darkest color, and I didn't do any extra blending for that. For the candy sticks, I did the same thing, meaning that I colored the entire image in with my lightest color. Then I added some diagonal stripes with the darker color using the black stamped lines as a guide. And then I went in with a white gel pen just to add a little bit more detail to the candy sticks. Okay, so moving right along, I wanted to be able to have the candy jar be put on the front of the card as one big piece. In order to do that, I created a backing for the jar by die cutting a piece of cardstock, and as you can see, I kind of did just a partial die cut, and then I colored it with RV00 just so that it wasn't so stark white when the shaker bits fell to the bottom. And I thought the RV00 was a light enough color that would still match the front of the jar, but without it becoming very distracting when the shaker bits fell to the bottom. Once I had that piece colored, I set that aside and started to work on my background panel. I used a piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock that was cut to 4 inches by 9 inches. It's slightly larger than the die that I'm going to use. I wanted to stencil a background, so I used Summer Splash ink from My Favorite Things, and I used the heart stencils from Honeybee Stamps. It's from their latest release, and I don't remember the exact name of it, but I'll be sure to have everything linked in the description below, along with the actual Copic colors that I used. So the stencil obviously is 6 by 6, which means it is smaller than my cardstock piece. So I stenciled the top half and then moved the stencil down a little bit, and I tried to get them lined up as best as I could. And you can see that there's a little bit of a shadow there, so I just used the remaining ink that was on my makeup blending brush just to go over that area where you could tell where I had moved the stencil. I knew that the candy jar was going to take up quite a bit of space, so I wasn't too worried about it being that noticeable once I got the candy jar on there. I used the second largest rectangle die from the Slimline Stitched Square die and die cut the stenciled piece. Then I put that piece into my stamp platform so I could stamp the sentiment. For the sentiment, I used the Sweet Sentimini stamp set, which is also by Trinity Stamps. I used the candy jar as a guide so I would know where to stamp the sentiment, and I started out by stamping the word sweet with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And this stamp is a brand new stamp, and I did stamp it twice, but I really didn't need to. It took the ink very well. The other thing that I like about this little Sentimini set is that in addition to the big word sweet, there are a bunch of little words that coordinate with it. And I chose to use You Make Life, and I stamped that also in the VersaFine Onyx Black. And for me, it's easier to stamp the large word before the smaller words. It seems that I can get them lined up a little bit better. Next, it was time to start putting my little candy jar together. So I put liquid glue on the piece of craft foam that was die cut so that I could adhere the stamped piece with the acetate on the back of it to the craft foam. And I thought that by tapping off all of the excess glue, I wouldn't have any glue squish out of the sides. And in theory, it was a great idea, except that with craft foam, you have to make sure that you have enough adhesive, and apparently I took too much adhesive off when I tapped it on the scratch paper. So I ended up going in on the side to add a little bit more liquid glue, and yep, the glue squished out and it got all over the acetate again. So I used my fingernail to scrape up the excess glue off the backside of the acetate, and I thought, well, that probably was good enough. It didn't seem like there were any streaks or anything. And then I decided to use my anti-static powder bag to get rid of the residual stick around the inside, just to make sure that my shaker bits didn't stick to it if there was any stickiness left. I used a brush to coat the acetate really well with the powder from my anti-static bag, and apparently there was quite a bit of residue left from the first time the glue spread out all over the acetate. So I cleaned that up with a little bit of rubbing alcohol, and that actually did it. It took off all of that residue and there was no stickiness left at all. Next, I took all of those pieces of candy that were left over from the previous card, and I actually still had some left over even after doing this card, and I put them in the jar where the shaker bits would go. Since I used stamped and colored images for my shaker bits, I made sure to have the candy colored side down, because when I flip it over, obviously I want to have the colored candy facing forward. Once I had all my candy bits in there, I put the piece of cardstock that I had colored pink on top of that and used liquid glue again and got it all over my fingers again. And then it was time to finish up putting the card together. I adhered the stenciled card panel to a piece of turquoise cardstock or teal cardstock, and I had run that through my Gemini Junior machine with the largest rectangle from the Slimline Stitch Square die set. I adhered that to the front of my card, and my finished card measures 8.5 by 3.5. The card base is 80-pound Nina cardstock, and to get that card base to be that size, I cut it to 8.5 by 7 and then folded it in half along the 7-inch side. Next, I put a good amount of liquid glue on the backside of the candy jar and put that in place. Then I placed an acrylic block on top of the candy jar just to hold it in place until the glue had a chance to grab on and set in a little bit. At that point, I thought that it still needed a little something, and lucky for me, I still had some candy pieces left over. So I put one of the double hearts up on the top, and I used liquid glue for that, and then I used 2 candy sticks, and I used liquid glue for those and put those down towards the bottom. And then I took one of the larger hearts, and at first I was going to adhere it flat as well, but I thought with the double craft foam of the candy jar that I should probably pop up that piece of candy, so I used a piece of foam tape for that. To finish up the card, I decided to add a little bit of sparkle and a little bit of shine, which was very much inspired by Courtney Krieber. So I used my Wink of Stella glitter pen and added some sparkle to the double heart up at the top and the large heart down at the bottom. After I added the sparkle, I used some glossy accents to go over those same 2 pieces of candy. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. Thank you so much for joining me. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.